Good morning, everyone. Some are calling the events of the last 2 weeks Democratic South Africa's darkest hour. The world and South Africans watched in disbelief as socio-economic and political tensions boiled over. Now, was the looting, the rioting, the violence merely a series of spontaneous events, or was this something a lot more carefully orchestrated? And what does this mean for ordinary South Africans, for SA Inc., from an investment, political, and economic perspective? I'm Demisha Greater, an investment analyst at Net Group Investments, and for the next 30 minutes, I'll be engaged in a conversation with editor-at-large and columnist Peter Bruce, and he'll be giving us his take on the state of South Africa. Peter, thank you so much for your time this morning. Very much appreciated. It's always great to have you on. I think maybe a good time or a good point for us to start while we're all trying to make sense of this. I want to refer back to one of your columns and something that you wrote there when all of this was happening, is that you said that you were torn about whether this was something that was planned or if it was something spontaneous, but you said that perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, because you said that the attacks on infrastructure were clear and were a thoughtful challenge to the state. Now that the dust has settled a little bit, has your take on what has occurred changed at all?
Morning to me. No, not at all. I still don't know whether this was an insurrection or a sort of rebellion, or just sort of mass mayhem. Clearly, as I said in that piece, clear attempts to damage infrastructure were discernible, and particularly worrying was the way a container carrying over 1 million rounds of ammunition was guarded by the police unusually, because the police don't normally guard this container, which is a regular arrival in the port of Durban, and it has now gone missing. And 1 million rounds of missing ammunition in South Africa in its current condition is not a happy thought. But it's very, very difficult to say that this was a planned insurrection. I kind of drift between both the Minister of Defense, who says that an insurrection needs a face, and obviously the people in the presidency who insist that it was an insurrection, although I see now that even they're beginning to step away from that. So what we had was a match dropping onto an extremely dry sort of field of problems, poverty, hunger, inequality, all of those things that just exploded. And it's I think the thing to worry about is less who caused it, although we want to know who did the infrastructure. But what do we do about it now?
Yeah, Peter, you mentioned a couple of things there that I think a lot of South Africans have been talking about. You mentioned poverty, the well-documented inequality that we have in South Africa, and coupled with that, we are in the throes of a pandemic. I guess then my question to you is, there are a lot of issues that need to be fixed clearly, and a lot of them are going to need some form of structural reform. And these are not things that are going to happen very quickly or overnight. So then the concerns that I think a lot of South Africans may have is, how likely is it that we could see something like this happen again? Could we see a repeat of what happened over the last 2 weeks?
I think the thing to do is that there are two answers to that to me. One is that that we're in a moment of great danger at the moment, because the government clearly is not in control of events. I had it was just a coincidence on my phone yesterday, where there was a tweet from the presidency on the same saying, "We have returned our ports, freight rail network and road system to full operational capacity. Our security forces are still out in full force." And the very next tweet said, "Transnet declares force majeure at SA ports over cyber attack." So, however much the president might want to be in charge, he isn't, and neither is the government. and there are things happening that rely on the common sense of ordinary South Africans to be resolved. And they're doing that, thank goodness. I think, close up, this looks like a mess that could happen again. If you stood back and said, what is this going to look like in 10, 15 years' time? It will be probably less dramatic. It'll probably be yet recognizable as a sort of another inflection point in our sort of road to wherever we happen to be going. I think the inflection point will be rather like, there've been a couple. Jacob Zuma's presidency was supposed to be about creating jobs. Cyril Ramaphosa's was supposed to be about creating infrastructure in order to create jobs. And I think, there comes a point in both of these things where there's where the goal and the forces on the ground supposed to deliver it become so separated from each other that you clearly recognize that the goal isn't going to be reached. And I think for President Ramaphosa, he might have reached that point now. He's set himself a goal of modernizing the economy and modernizing our infrastructure because it's vital to our economic growth. But he's been way too slow, and I don't think he's going to have the time any longer to pick up and finish the job. A lot of people disagree with that, but I think he politically and the party, the ANC particularly, have had an incredible shock. And I can't see them easily recovering from this without having to do enormous damage to the sort of fragile unity that Cyril Ramaphosa needed in order to just hold the ANC together. He's going to absolutely have to reshuffle his cabinet quite dramatically, even though he doesn't want to. And he's going to have to possibly consider completely scrapping the intelligence services, which have so badly let him down. There's no point to them. They don't know what's going on. Some of them are, in fact, stand accused of instigating much of this violence and mayhem we saw the other day. It was P.W. Botha is not going to go down in South African history as a great savior of anything, but he was a wise politician in his time, and he scrapped the intelligence services at his disposal in the mid-'80s or late '80s and replaced them with something completely different. He hired Neil Barnard to build a new intelligence service. And that's what's required here, clearly. The intelligence services are not telling the president what is going on. In fact, they might even be hiding things from him.
Pete, I'm going to touch a little bit on what you've said regarding the reshuffling of the cabinet, but you said a couple of things that I'd like to to talk about.
Sure.
The fact that this may happen again, or the fear that this may happen again, is a very valid one, and perhaps maybe we should try and balance this somewhat, because if we go back to say 1960, we had Sharpeville, which was known worldwide, and it was only then surpassed by 1976 with the Soweto uprising, and then in the 1980s we had low-level civil war, and we had the state of emergency, which was then declared. But at every single time we've seen South Africa being able to pull back from the precipice. I want to go back again to the comment that you made in one of your columns, and it was regarding the first appearance that the president made on that Monday night. And you were, it comes across that you were quite frustrated in that you said that the president should have been a lot more animated. He should have assumed the worst. In your view, then, should the president have called for, a state of emergency, or would that have been a step too far? And if that was the case, then what would have been the ramifications from an economic or political perspective then?
Well, to me, I think I remember the Monday night address, and basically my point was that it was a very wooden appearance, and it seemed just to be an extension of the night before when he'd spoken about the coronavirus and the new level of restrictions. But clearly what had happened between the two addresses was dramatic. and he showed no sense of it being dramatic. You cannot simply appear as this sort of wooden person in front of a screen who reads off a teleprompter and then says, I thank you, and leaves. That's not leadership. Leadership involves reassuring people and making them believe that that if they listen to you, that they're going to be okay. I'm not sure that a state of emergency would have been the right way to go. We're already in a state of disaster. Topping that with a state of emergency would have been complicated, and I think it would have had to have required parliamentary approval, or certainly it was a challengeable thing to do, and I'm not sure legally how a state of disaster, which we're in because of the coronavirus, would coexist with a state of emergency. I don't know enough about the Constitution to do that, but what was clear was that was needed were some harsher words or some sense of determination to stop what was clearly that Monday the beginning of the most unbelievable uprising of whatever one wants to describe it. And clearly also on that Monday, he didn't appreciate that. Clearly he didn't have the intelligence, and I'm not talking about his own intelligence. He didn't have the wherewithal. He didn't know what was going on because nobody was telling him the truth. And one of the problems that Cyril Ramaphosa has always had from day one in his presidency, he's surrounded himself with very, very poor advisors. He has a very weak office. People who are experienced are not in that office. He's become increasingly difficult for his friends to talk to him. He's become sort of more and more isolated. He's been sort of sucked down into the party machine from the Cyril of old, and it's been to his detriment, I'm afraid, and ours as well, because he's not hearing the voices of South Africans. And you're right to say, that what happens after these events that throughout our history is that South Africans somehow get it together again. And that's why I say, if you look at this, you've got to look at this now and feel the fear and the uncertainty, but also go back, go forward 20 years and it'll look like something, but it won't look this bad. And South Africans have an incredible way of pulling together or pulling themselves together out of incredibly difficult situations. And I say that probably even more so about Black South Africans who've had much more difficulty to deal with in their lives than white ones have. But nonetheless, Jan Smuts used to say that South Africa was a country where neither the best nor the worst ever happens. And I think I continue to believe that. I don't believe that we're on the brink of collapse. And neither, on the other hand, do I believe that that the green shoots of recovery are showing out all over the place. They're not. The green shoots of recovery have been trampled and stampled in those stampedes into shops and businesses of 2 weeks ago. And that will have really shaken investor confidence, both local and domestic. And you get nowhere without investment in this economy. And the only way that I can see to pick ourselves up off the floor now is for the government to step back and perhaps say to the private sector, for a period, you get on with it, we'll get out of your way. Fix what you've got to fix. Tell us what we need to do to help you fix it. But because really what needs to happen is that those private sector companies have got to produce profits, which can then be taxed, which tax revenue the government can then use to do what Tito Mboweni is going to try and do this afternoon, which is to describe where the money is going to come from for the welfare payments that Cyril Ramaphosa has outlined in order to pay for the pain and hardship that has been caused by the violence the last 2 weeks. Somebody's got to make the money, and only business can make the money. The government hasn't got a clue how to make money. We know this now. There've been more than one paper I've read recently where even left-wing economists are saying, listen, this government is so poor at execution that what it has to understand and recognize that and step back for a period in which the private sector can then be allowed to just let it rip, do what it does best, which is make loads of money so that you can tax it and spend it.
Peter, can I just come in there because you mentioned a couple of things for the government stepping back. So if our clients or investors are watching this right now and they're listening to you, and you've engaged with several policymakers, leaders, what is the one thing that if our president then had to take to the podium tonight that you would be looking for from him, for him to say in order to restore confidence in South Africa, restore confidence in SA Inc. What is the one thing that you are wanting to hear from him or see from him? So what would this practically look like, the stepping back and letting the private sector take control for a little while?
Well, can I have two things? One would be to announce that they have in fact arrested major figures in this period of unrest, and two, that he calls on the private sector to tell the government what it is that they need in order to make as much money in as short a period of time as possible, and what thing is it that they require from him that he can give them that would help them make that money, because he needs to tax those profits. So that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see some decent arrests, which I fear are not going to happen. And then the government sort of saying to business, how can we help you make an awful lot of money very quickly?
I want to talk a little bit about what you mentioned with regarding the tax space. Obviously, you've got the NHI. There's also been a lot of traction that has come in terms of the welfare program. Do you think that South Africa is digging themselves into too much of a debt hole? Should the funds, could they be better utilized in maybe plowing it into infrastructure and physically rebuilding the infrastructure that we have, destroyed? I mean, just your view on needing to get a balance of these things, getting the NHI going and then also having to actually partake or get those economic reforms going.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that the NHI will obviously be a political flag that'll get waved at us for a long time, but we are nowhere near being able to finance anything that ambitious. It's been interesting watching the private sector and public sector get a vaccine rollout together. It took them some time, and it now seems to be working pretty well. But don't forget how important always it is in this country that the private sector gets sort of not set free, but that the private sector is encouraged to do what it does best. I'm probably not answering your question properly to me, but South Africa is an interesting economy. We basically are a farming economy and a mining economy, and in both of those, infrastructure is very helpful. So we need to be an efficient farming and mining economy, and what we can't do now, and there's a classic case with the port in Durban at the moment. Citrus farmers can't export anything through Durban because the computer systems have fallen over. So you can't load containers digitally because you can't find them. And so we desperately need secure infrastructure. And I don't think anybody argues with that. It's infrastructure spending always is a good thing. And to the extent that the president can stick to that line, it will reward him. But he is always going to be sidetracked by other things. He will let himself be sidetracked, it seems. Things like localization, which, while it might create some jobs in old companies that can't compete like, the steel makers, but it's also going to destroy jobs that already exist in areas that can compete, but which won't be able to afford expensive locally made products. So he needs to he's not going to do this, but I mean, what he should do is try and pick his way through what's going to work and what's not going to work, and throw away what's not going to work and just go for broke. Because he's, up until 2 weeks ago, Cyril Ramaphosa was pretty much ambling towards a second term as president. And I don't think that's the case anymore. This is what is happening now, particularly with these intelligence services and the clear differences of opinion about what's happened in public, and in contradiction of him about what has happened, whether this was an insurrection or not, or who was to blame. It's just a mess, and he looks politically weak, and there will be people, sharpening their, not knives, but their political programs ahead of an ANC elective conference at the end of next year. There's still plenty of time to mount a decent challenge to somebody who is doing as poor a job as he is now.
I certainly would like to get into more detail around that as we look ahead to election time. So I'm going to park that for a little bit, but I want to latch onto something that you've said, and it was with regards to, you'd like to see more decent arrests. We certainly have made some progress. I mean, over the last couple of weeks, with the violence that occurred, and of course, rightfully so, we sometimes tend to forget some of the headway that we've made. So I want to go back to maybe some of the frustrations that come with, say, the Zondo Commission. A few months ago, I had a discussion with one of our independent analysts, JP Landman, and he was talking about, a lot of South Africans are getting quite frustrated by the Zondo Commission, saying they're not seeing a lot of people in those orange jumpsuits, but we sometimes tend to take our focus away from the things that are being done. So we've got, the Special Investigation Unit. There are things that are being done there. Just your take there, Peter, on, we're very quick sometimes to talk about what's going wrong, but there certainly are things that are being done. And yes, the wheels of justice are moving slowly, but they are moving. Or am I incorrect?
No, there's a nice grinding progress, but it is slow, and it needs to be recognized. And JP Landman does a great job of recognizing those things. So we forget that Cyril Ramaphosa has cleaned out the revenue service. He's tried to rebuild the NPA. He's got new leadership at the NPA. The NPA's new leadership has indeed instituted charges in a number of quite high-profile state capture events. We remember the Estina Dairy project, and obviously the asbestos project in the Free State has snared now suspended ANC Secretary General Asa Magashule, who faces multiple charges of fraud. And the SIU seems to be able to act much more efficiently, actually, than the NPA, largely because the NPA requires the police to do their job properly, and the police are very, very poorly led at the moment. We'll come back to that. But yes, so institutionally, Ramaphosa has had some absolutely clear successes. Clearly, what has failed is that institutionally, he is still not at the point where he can say, I wash my hands of all of this because it'll get looked after by the Constitutional Court or whatever. I mean, the Constitutional Court, when it sentenced Jacob Zuma for contempt of court for not appearing at the Zondo Commission, left him a full week, more than a week, to hand himself in, which turned out to be probably a rather dangerous thing to have done, because it allowed people enough time to prepare a response to what was inevitable. It was always inevitable that he was going to go to jail once the Constitutional Court had said so. So in some respects, the police then, when he did, after he had failed to hand himself in the 5 days or whatever he was given then another, or the police were given another 3 days to arrest him. And they took the whole 3 days to arrest him because, they didn't want to see it in Kandla, whatever it might have been. But the fact is, all that time allowed the people who were planning this raid on that warehouse and this piece of infrastructure or whatever it might have been to prepare. And they did prepare, and you could see the infrastructure attacks happening. And so even if you do get your institutions working properly, that doesn't always mean to say that they're going to make sensible decisions. But nonetheless, he's had some real success. Let's not take that away from him. And given who might replace him, you sort of you don't want him to fail. But you would have to call the current this current period now is a failure of his government and his leadership. Whatever J.P. Luntman has to say about it.
Peter, I'm just cognizant of time, but I'm going to try and steal a few more minutes.
Sure.
You mentioned, the incarceration of our former president, Jacob Zuma. So we always like to get some, feedback from our clients, and this was actually one question that came through because I obviously want to know your take on it. And the question was, what do you think Zuma's next play would be, given that it looks as though President Ramaphosa has won on a number of fronts now that, of course, Zuma finds himself behind bars. Do you have any thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, well, look, I don't think Jacob Zuma is himself a factor in politics anymore. There's no comeback for him. There's no, he's not going to be leading a breakaway party from the ANC or trying to establish himself in politics again. But that doesn't mean to say that he is not going to be a thorn in Ramaphosa's flesh. Jacob Zuma will come out of prison in about with parole sometime. I think it's in September. He has between that September and the following December 22, to make life as difficult as possible for Ramaphosa in the run-up to the ANC conference leadership election. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if, given the circumstances now and given Ramaphosa's leadership of them, that people will start putting their hands up to oppose him or to challenge him for the leadership of the party. And, some of them will find support from Jacob Zuma, and that might make a difference in KwaZulu-Natal. And some other people might not be looking for it. So he's not, he's going to be he'll be a worrying factor for Ramaphosa, but not a decisive one, I don't think.
I want to talk a little bit about the forthcoming elections. You mentioned the ANC elections that are due at the end of 2022, but there's also been calls to delay the local elections that were supposed to take place or are meant to take place in October this year to February. If you think about it, it's really a couple of months, and you could understand from, for example, the IEC standpoint, concerns around COVID, concerns about the preparedness. So there are valid, reasons for wanting to shift or to postpone the elections. But then, of course, there's the other side where, and I think the opposition, the DA, have been quite vocal about this, saying, if you postpone or you move an election, what is the precedent that you are setting? So does that mean that in future, if there are unfavorable conditions, a government could then be in a position to move elections at a later stage? What's your view on that, on the proposal of possibly moving the elections from October to February next year?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question, because it gives us a roadmap of where we're going politically over the next couple of years. So there's due to be a local government election in, I think it was going to be October the 27th. the IEC then asked Judge Dikgang Moseneke to have a look at that and to advise them on possibly delaying it because of COVID. Then next year, there is, in December next year, there is an ANC conference which will either re-elect Ramaphosa as its leader or elect somebody else, which would mean probably, as has happened both with Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma in the past, that their state presidency ships would be cut short. And then there's an election, general election due for 2024. So those are the big kind of, you can map your politics by them really. And you know, as the closer you get to these elections, the more hysterical our politics becomes. So what has happened now is that Judge Moseneke advised the IEC that the reasonable thing to do would be to delay the next local government elections until February. The IEC is thinking about it. There might be a challenge in court, and the courts might say, no, you can't delay them. It's a tricky thing. I mean, what people are trying to do, to me, I don't think there's an effort here just to sort of string it out and kick the can down the road so that no party has to face an election, but I might be being naive about that. There is a genuine attempt, I think, to make sure they are fair. And so what you need is a reasonable period for registration. And it's very difficult to do that now ahead of October with, with COVID still being pretty rampant, the Delta variant in South Africa. So they would be hoping for registration maybe in October, early November, when transmission rates fall a bit. I don't know that a February election would be all that bad a thing. What you hope, obviously, is that a fourth wave, which is probably inevitable, we don't know when that's going to fall. The most likely event is that it would be triggered by the Christmas holidays when people are all, together again and, being happy and drinking and having fun and hugging and kissing and all that sort of thing. So if that is the case, that means that the end of December, January into February becomes fourth wave time and you can't hold an election then. So it might well be that the courts say, no, let's just go ahead with it now and take the risk. It's perfectly possible to hold an election, by the way, safely in these circumstances. Other countries have done it, and we could do it too. I don't think that the ANC or would get away, or the IEC would get away with anything further out than February.
Peter, I'm going to have to leave it at that for today, but there was certainly so much more that we could discuss. We'll just have to get you back again, maybe for one of our multi-manager insights later on in the year. But thank you so much for your time and your insights. Very, very valuable. Of course, that was Peter Bruce. He is the editor-at-large and columnist that you probably would have seen while reading the Sunday paper or the Daily Maverick or Financial Mail, whatever it may be. His insights always very welcome. So we are cognizant of time, so we're going to wrap up, but I think maybe just a few points before we do that. We obviously like to keep a balanced view of the discussions that we've had, and one of our independent analysts that I alluded to earlier on, JP Landman, had actually taken out an article, and in some of the things he also reflects on the happenings that we've seen over the last 2 weeks or so. And just to read a very brief extract from what he had written. And he said that yes, the rule of law had certainly been challenged, and we can't say that it is completely over. We still need to be vigilant. South Africa as a constitution, or the constitutionality of South Africa, has been passed with flying colors. But we also shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we have paid a very hefty price in terms of lives, jobs, and businesses that were also lost. So I think here the call is that we need to certainly create a more inclusive South Africa. Africa. Well, that's it from us in terms of Net Group Investments Insights. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll be looking forward to having you join us again for more insights. From myself, Demisha Greater, it's goodbye.